Hello everyone, my name's Victoria Knight. I'm the convener of the Prisons and Probation Research Hub here at De Montfort University. This morning I want to introduce you to two of our key prisons researchers, and we're going to hear a little bit about their research. I want to firstly introduce Lucy Baldwin, who leads our Women's and Families Research Division here. And also Ross Little, who is doing research and leading on prison education. I'll also speak a little bit about my own research around digitisation within prisons and criminal justice settings. First of all, I'd want to introduce Lucy. Hello, Lucy.
Morning.
Morning. Tell us a little bit about your research. Deeply fascinating and interesting. What's the sort of focus of your research, Lucy?
Thank you very much. Like I said, my name's Lucy Baldwin and I'm a convener of the Women, Family, Crime and Justice Network at De Montfort, which is a very active research network. And my research is predominantly around motherhood and prison. So exploring how motherhood and maternal emotions and the maternal role interacts with the prison space, and how the impact, if you like, of those interactions endures beyond prison. So, for example, some of the mothers that I've interviewed are 46 years post-release, but they're still exhibiting the impact. They're still talking about the impact of their prison sentence on their lives as mothers and as grandmothers. So that's predominantly my focus. It's around motherhood.
Okay, and what are you finding, Lucy, throughout your study? What are the kind of key findings for you?
Well, I've had several research projects, and one of them was a joint project with Rona Epstein, and we looked specifically at the impact of short sentences on mothers and children. And you know, we concluded, if you like, that the impact of even just a few weeks in prison for mothers had really lifelong implications for mothers and children, in terms of their emotions, in terms of the psychological impact, in terms of the practical impact, the financial impact. There literally was not an area of their lives that was left untouched by the prison sentence. So that was a specific piece of work about short sentences. My other work doesn't specify any kind of sentence length, and it looks at in much more depth, I suppose, about the impact on maternal identity and maternal role, and how that's altered through prison, and how I think in the past we've really missed opportunities to recognise the impact of maternal emotion. And you know, a lot of mothers go into custody and their children remain their primary focus, and that is the case whether they're mothers when they go into custody, or whether they're going pregnant, or whether they have lost their children to care, or they might not get their children when they leave prison. Those maternal emotions remain their focus during their sentence. And that's not always addressed. And so you see things like disengagement in sentence planning, you see increased incidence of self-harm and suicide. And sadly, you know, there are a number of mothers who have taken their own lives in prison, and not having their maternal identity and their maternal emotions addressed is absolutely part of that. And one of the things that mothers have spoken to me about is how, because that's not acknowledged, they disengage. And as we know, that if people are disengaged, then not only are their family relationships affected, but also their desistance, their opportunities to fully rehabilitate, and their opportunities for their families to be supported. So we're missing opportunities, A, to support families, B, to support mothers, and C, in relation to desistance. And also, we're not equipping, I mean, one of the things I've found is that staff are really not equipped to deal with maternal emotion. They don't feel confident asking the questions. When they do, sometimes they're asking them wrong and they're making the situation worse. But there are officers who make an enormous difference and literally save lives. So it's about, if you like, recognising that and framing those conversations, and looking at how the prison space, the prison relationships can be supported to support women and staff differently. And that I suppose is where we're going forwards from in terms of the research. And I know you wanted me to talk about impact.
Yeah.
And in terms of impact going forward, the research has already been accepted by the Ministry of Justice and by a number of organisations that work with people in prison. And I have worked with PACT, Prison Advice and Care Trust, to develop some in-prison programmes to support mothers. And those programmes help mothers in terms of managing their emotions, but also preparing for release, because mothers tend to have this idea that the minute they get out, it'll all be fine. And it really isn't all fine. For some mothers, that's when, you know, the impact really hits them, and it can be really challenging. So that programme is about preparing mothers, but fundamentally it's about creating a safe space for mothers to talk about their maternal emotions in prison and to be able to have those conversations with staff. So again, in parallel to that, I've also developed some training for staff that has been piloted. Some of the staff is going to be embedded into prison officer and probation officer training, which is wonderful to support staff in working with mothers. But I'm also working with the Ministry of Justice and with Sodexo at the minute to develop other means of supporting women in custody, through custody and after custody. So in terms of impact, I think it will be huge for the mothers, she says modestly.
That's brilliant, Lucy. Thank you for covering that. And I know that your work receives lots of attention, and certainly at high level. And you've given evidence, that's right,
I gave evidence for the female offender strategy and for the female focused farmer review, and also for the Joint Human Rights Committee inquiry into maternal imprisonment. And my recommendations kind of were accepted and are included, along with lots of others, in the reports that have come out of those inquiries. And there's been an additional inquiry as a review of the care and management of pregnant prisoners and new mothers in prison. And hopefully some of the stuff that I'm involved in will be part of the work going forwards from that other review as well.
Thank you very much, Lucy.
You're very welcome.
Ross, are you there? Hi, Ross.
Hello, very good, Lucy. I was very impressed.
I know.
A tough act to follow.
Oh, bless you. I'd like to introduce Ross Little, who's doing some fascinating research on education within prison settings. So then, Ross, just tell us about the specific focus of your research.
That's right. I'm the convener of the Learning in Prisons and Probation Network, which is part of the Prisons and Probation Research Hub. My PhD research is focusing on how we create learning spaces in prisons, particularly for life sentence prisoners and those experiencing long sentences. We know that in recent years, over the past kind of 15 to 20 years, the number of people sentenced to long terms of imprisonment in England and Wales has increased quite dramatically. And we also know from previous research that education and learning opportunities can support the desistance process. That's the process by which people move away from former kind of criminal lifestyles and environments. And we know that this is particularly important. The educational and learning opportunities particularly important for people in prison, people on long sentences who can get stuck in what some people have called the extended present. So this idea that kind of getting stuck in terms of their identity, the currency of the past has already been spent, really, and they're trying to work out who they are and what their future looks like. As part of my work, I instigated an 8-week learning program, whereby we brought De Montfort University students into the prison environment to learn alongside life sentence prisoners. And that was a really quite incredible experience for all of us. I think we all learnt quite a lot about ourselves, about others, about the process of learning, what some people call pedagogy. And I'm really interested in how that bringing the outside into the prison helps to create those kind of more effective learning opportunities. Prison cultures can be really quite stultifying and damaging and harmful for people, can inhibit that desistance process that I've mentioned. And so bringing the outside in, that slice of normality, a sense of the outside, and the present outside life into the prison can be really quite powerful. It's early days in the research in some respects, but there's some evidence that the process can help support what we call narrative construction or reconstruction, whereby people start to have a different sense of themselves. I recall strongly one of the prison students say that he found that the experience had helped him kind of learn how to have a discussion, have an argument without resorting to violence. And that was something kind of more powerful than we could have expected to come about as part of this program, but interesting that some students talking in those terms. I think maybe one of the biggest surprises was that there weren't just benefits for the prison students, but there were great benefits for the university students too. So it really, this program provided an opportunity whereby students could see an institution they'd heard so much about as part of their course, namely prison, but actually start to understand more about the practical, the moral and the emotional side of prison life in a way that they hadn't previously encountered. I think it also had an impact on their ambitions and maybe what they wanted to do later on in their lives too. So it's been a really interesting experience, and researching it is a real privilege at the moment. And I think there's a number of areas where we could take this in the future, but linking it in with the probation part of the network too, I think one of the interesting angles would be how we sustain some of the experience of this program, not only in prison, but perhaps beyond the prison walls. And that'll be something that I'm really interested to explore, both in terms of research, but also development opportunities as well in the future.
As well, Ross, you're publishing. Well, both of you are publishing as you go along. What's your next publishing project, Ross?
Yeah, okay. So that's probably something I should have mentioned. So far I've tended to focus on children's education in prison, which I find really interesting and really important. The project I've just been talking about focuses on adult education, and really that's probably a useful lens by which we should look at this work, is really thinking about it as lifelong learning or adult education. In terms of upcoming publications, I'm really interested to explore that process of learning in prison, how we create those effective learning spaces in prison, and I'll be publishing on those subjects, and also a term known as pedagogical capital. So thinking about the way in which we can generate and enhance pedagogical capital amongst prison students and university students, and the staff that are facilitating the course. One thing that's been really notable is that it's not just the prison students or the university students that are learning, but it's the facilitators too. So I think lots to reflect on and write about there. The experience of running these courses as well is something I'd like to write about, the emotional, the practical and the moral aspects, and I think there could well be an opportunity to tie in there with the a new area of criminology known as sensory criminology, where we're unpicking aspects of the emotional and the sensory experience of doing this type of work in prison and these prison and university partnerships.
Thank you so much, Ross. That's really
Thank you.
good. Thank you. You're both brilliant.
Ross, interested. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Victoria Knight, who is the convener of the Prisons Research Hub, and it's going to be wonderful to hear a bit more about Vic's research. So fire away, Vic.
So I suppose in the last 7 years, most of my research has been focusing on what I'm calling the digitisation of our prisons, and this is about focusing on the role that digital technologies has within prison settings. And I've been very, very privileged, I believe, to watch the unfolding of the digital or smart technologies being introduced into prisons. And we often think that most of us on the outside world are used to technology. It's part of our everyday lives now. I would argue that we're not online anymore, we're on life, that our smart technology is part of. Our prisons are completely different. They are deprived of communication, irrespective of, never mind digital technologies. So my sort of body of work has been growing, and I've been working on a number of projects. And because what I'm kind of calling it at the moment is the birth of digital technologies within our prisons, and a lot of my work focuses on international prisons. So I've been lucky enough to go to Denmark, Belgium. I'm working with the Taiwanese prison service at the moment. So I get lots of insights, and there are small pockets of technologies being introduced into prisons. And I'll just give you some examples, introducing, I suppose, technological services such as prisoners being able to order their meals, send an email to their friends and family, to book appointments, to book their visits. In some countries, they can access their legal files online. They can rent films, listen to TV and radio, use the telephone through these smart technologies, access e-learning. And what we're sort of finding at the moment, and what's also wonderful about my work, I get to work with different scholars, particularly outside the university, as well as practitioners. And at the moment, we're doing things like a global survey to see where prison services are at with, their journey into the digital world. And I think what we're finding is that technology is not neutral. We think that, our TV in the corner of our room is just part of our furniture. It's not. It actually shapes how we live our lives. And so it's not neutral. And so we're doing a lot of work with prison services at the moment. And we're developing, I think, tools or recommendations and frameworks for prison services to actually digitise the prisons in ethically grounded ways. We don't want technology, and the community that I'm working with at the moment is that we don't want technology to create further harm within the prison. We want it to be positive. We want it to be therapeutic. So there's lots of e-health opportunities, for example, people coping with addictions, people coping with mental health, for example. Technology does have a place there. And your work, Lucy, when you talked about, mothers staying connected with their children whilst they're in prison, and the importance of having regular and healthy contact with their children. Technology has a positive role to play in that. Sadly, investment with our prison services in line with digital technologies is very, very poor. but also there's a big fear about introducing technology within our prisons. I did a study a couple of years ago with a scholar and researcher, Dr. Lee Hadlington, who's now at Nottingham-Trent University, looking at how the public view the introduction of technologies into our prison. So deeply fascinating. And what we found is that the public, for example, aren't as punitive as we're led to believe. So there's a lot of work I think we have to do around fear, and this is why we need to work closely. Certainly the evidence that I'm getting through with different studies that I'm doing is working closely with prison services and often private developers, because these are the guys that are creating the digital solutions, is to work closely with them to ensure that that technology is meeting the needs of all the stakeholders.
We saw, didn't we, during COVID, just how important digital technology was, and that ties in with your other research about the emotional benefits of having positive communication through digital technology.
Absolutely, and the importance of not creating further harm, actually swinging it the other way. So at the moment, what we're doing is we've grown a very small network, and it's an international network of scholars and practitioners. And what we want to do is contribute to a kind of new and emerging discipline, what we're going to be calling digital desistance. So the role that technology has in desistance, and all those narratives that you've both talked about this morning, and how technology can assist. And we're very committed to doing that in ethical ways. And if we think about wider society, and as soon as we digitize, big companies have got our data. What are they going to do with that data? When we're talking about people who are deprived of rights and autonomy, particularly in prison settings in the criminal justice landscape, as soon as things become digitized, for example, who owns that data? What rights do prisoners have, for example, in terms of accessing their emails once they leave the prison? They can take a handwritten letter with them when they leave the prison, but can they take those emails that were really so important to them during their incarceration? So in terms of impact, I'm having, and collectively, we're having quite a lot of impact in terms of how prison service strategize, develop strategies, and where their investments are required. And we're very committed to, like both of you, in terms of centering the voices of the people whose needs need to be met. So it is about designing strategies that are both ethical, morally driven, that will ultimately lead to desistance or contribute to those desistance journeys, as well as rehabilitation.
Fascinating, Vic. Thank you. That was brilliant.
Good stuff.
Yeah, dead interesting.
Vic, just add one more thing in, and potentially it links aspects of all three elements of research. I realised something that I didn't say originally was, I think an important emerging aspect is an element of trust as well. Something we found in the prison classroom was this generating trust and an ability for the students, or desire for the students to trust each other. It was something that was quite fundamental to the approach of the work, and I think it can't be taken for granted. And it's
definitely not.
It does run through that work. I think it is partly about being seen as an outsider and being an outsider, and listening carefully and trying to understand where people are at, because sometimes the lives in prison are so disconnected with the outside world, and there's been so many kind of rupturing of relationships.
And I think what you're talking about there is some like feminist research, because you're obviously a feminist researcher in the way you think, and it's a shame that it's been boxed into feminism, that some of those issues are specifically feminist in the research, when actually it's about good research. It's about being a good researcher.
I think you're absolutely right. It is the gender dynamic in the room is really, really interesting. I'm sure I'm not sophisticated enough to describe it yet, but it's really interesting that the prison students are male, because I'm working in a male prison. The university students, in the case of the program I'm looking at, were all female. But the facilitators have tended to be male, not exclusively. But the way in which I think this topic possibly is feminized in a way, and maybe how, you know, there's fear involved, I think, on the part of men, or maybe not thinking that it's interesting for them, or it's dangerous, I don't know, or not masculine, I don't know, but I think there's no reason for any of that, or no reason why it can't evolve.
I think between us all, and certainly that I think what we're excellent at De Montfort, certainly within our department, and the work that we do is we're very, very closely aligned to practice, aren't we? And the practice of teaching, the practice of supporting mothers, the practice of digitisation, and that I think our ethos collectively is that we ultimately want to reduce the dependence on imprisonment. We know we've got imprisonment. Let's make it kinder, softer, healthier, you know, and
but it's all those questions about legitimization as well, isn't it? And yeah, I think it's a really interesting area of debate. I think you're right about that kind of you know, I think being proudly a practitioner researcher.
Definitely. Or an activist researcher as well.
Yes.
Owning that, I think it's taken years to be sort of proud of that in a way, and because it's still kind of sniffed at, I think, in some circles.
I think
but I think
it's more widely accepted, definitely. But there is an old school, because there used to be, when I first started my PhD, I think there were discussions about why you're crossing boundaries, and now it's like, cross the boundaries. Do you know what I mean? Do it.
Yes.
You know, and you know, I think that's really important, and it was something I felt really, really strongly about. And you know, I maintain links with a lot of my participants, and will be publishing with a lot of my participants. You know, with one of them, I've got a book that, you know, we're editing together, and it's. I think that's all part of it as well. It's about not othering as well. It's so important. It's so important. But again, that's a whole chapter in my PhD as well.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to run out of time. Right, thanks both.
Yeah, and
see you in a minute.
Yes, bye. Thank you.